Welcome to Free Speech Unmuted, the Hoover Institution podcast on free speech. I'm your co-host, Eugene Volokh. I'm a senior fellow here at Hoover and an emeritus law professor. See, check out the gray hair. Emeritus law professor at UCLA. And our other co-host is Jane Bambauer, who is definitely not an emeritus professor.
Although I do dye my hair, so it's a little hard to tell.
I wasn't going to speculate about that, but at the University of Florida Law School, and we every couple of weeks we have a program on whatever is in the news, or sometimes whatever should be in the news with regard to free speech. So here we have a couple of cases involving student speech. And student speech that is perceived, at least by some, as potentially threatening and advocating violence. In both instances, potentially, at least could be understood as advocating violence against Jews. So we'll talk about both of these cases, but Jane is going to start us off with one which is at her very own law school, University of Florida Law School. So Jane, tell us about the Damsky case.
Yes, this is a homegrown case. So Preston Damsky is a law student who had a series of controversial, was involved in a series of controversial things, I'd say, that happened on campus. So the first few things that happened was that he started writing in seminar papers his theory of constitutional law, claiming that the United States was founded as a white nationalist nation, and in at least one of the seminar papers, he advocated for sort of demographic reemergence of white Americans by force if necessary, and a student asked him for clarification. By the way, at least this seminar paper was distributed to other students because there was a peer review process, and so one of the students asked if he actually meant violence, extralegal violence, and he said yes. So he was sort of in a very academic way advocating for extralegal violence. And a few other things happened, which maybe there was sort of a series of on-campus incidents, which we can get into later. But I think the final straw that led to Damsky's suspension or expulsion, which he then challenged, involved a social media post. So he went on X and he posted, my position on Jews is simple. Whatever Harvard professor Noel Ignatieff meant by his call to abolish the white race by any means necessary is what I think must be done with Jews. Jews must be abolished by any means necessary. By the way, for background, I had originally, when I saw this written out, I had assumed that he was sort of reposting some sort of kind of hateful post that a Harvard professor had just made, but no. So for listeners who were as confused as, or might be as confused as I was, this is actually a Harvard professor who died a number of years ago, and wrote about abolishing whiteness, but in a much more constructive, nonviolent way, advocating for the concept of whiteness to be scaled back, as I understand it anyway. So, but in any case, this alarmed his post. Damsky's post alarmed some people, and a UF law professor who was Jewish actually replied online on social media and asked, are you saying that you would murder me and my family? Is that your position? And Damsky replied, did Ignatieff want whites murdered? If so, were his words as objectionable as mine? If Ignatieff sought genocide, then surely a genocide of all whites would be an even greater outrage than a genocide of all Jews, given the far greater number of whites. And then the professor said, again, online, I notice you didn't say no, but instead resorted to whataboutism. Yes, his words are despicable, but you implicitly admit yours are too. And that's where that exchange ended. But that was, like I said, that was the final, that plus possibly him wearing a a from the river to the sea T-shirt seemed to be the final the last facts that led ultimately to his expulsion. So he challenged that, and I think we'll get to the law in a minute, but there's another sort of case with some parallel facts, and maybe we should bring that on board too, Eugene, or do you want to first say what happened in this
Oh,
case?
well, let's first talk about the Damsky case
Okay.
some more, in part because what happened here was a federal appellate decision by the 11th Circuit, staying a district court decision that had the district court decision came out in favor of Damsky. The 11th Circuit panel stayed that, and
Yeah.
federal appellate court decisions are much more influential than district court decisions. Let's talk a little bit more about the Damsky case, and then we'll turn to the
Yeah.
Ohio
Okay.
State. So in the Damsky case, it came up before a panel of three judges. By the way, all three judges were appointees of President Trump's. So this wasn't one of those things where when there's a 2-to-1 split, as there was on this panel, that you'd say, well, it's the liberals on one side, conservatives on the other, or vice versa. All three are pretty conservative judges.
Hmm.
The majority opinion, which was written by Judge Elizabeth Branch and joined by Judge Barbara Lagoa, basically made two arguments. One was that in context, Damsky's statement could be reasonably perceived as a threat. Now, maybe it could be perceived, let's say, a threat of violence. Maybe it could be perceived otherwise, just like Ignatiev's claim, I suppose. Many people do perceive it as just abolish whiteness in the sense of not treat whites as having any privilege over anybody else. That is to say, make sure that whites don't have any such privilege. On the other hand, you could say, by
Hmm.
any means necessary. Well, that sounds like possibly including violent means, right? So many statements are ambiguous. The panel says this statement might be ambiguous, but at least it could reasonably be interpreted as a threat. And as a result, a public university is entitled given that reasonable interpretation and given the disruption that this caused to classwork, could decide that the student has to be removed in order to prevent people from feeling threatened by him. But the panel also added a second argument here. It said the second reason is because the posts likely promoted extra legal violence. So, independently of their perhaps being perceived as a threat that the speaker himself would engage in illegal violence, that's what a true threat of violence is. If somebody says, I'm going to commit violence, or my co conspirators will commit violence, it could just be advocacy of violence. But even such advocacy of violence is potentially constitutionally unprotected. And it cited the Tinker v. Des Moines case, which was a K through 12 school case, which suggested, I oversimplify here, but suggested that speech within the educational context may be more restricted. There was a follow-up case, Morse v. Frederick, in the K through 12 context, which dealt with advocacy of illegal drug use, or at least perceived advocacy of illegal drug use. The court says when people are advocating violence, that is something that could be potentially punished by a university, even though it can't be criminally punished because it's not advocating imminent illegal violence and therefore isn't constitutionally unprotected incitement. And that's
And
true.
it picked up from Tinker this idea that that the question then in the school context, in this case the university context, is whether there is reasonable disruption.
Right. So it partly picked up from Tinker the sense that speech can be punished if it's reasonably disruptive, perhaps because it's seen as threatening. But it also picked up from that follow-up case to Tinker, or a later case involving K through 12 speech, Morse v. Frederick, the sense that even speech that isn't particularly disruptive could be punished if it advocates illegal violence. Even if it
Mhm.
can't be criminally punished, it could be punished through discipline, student discipline, or expulsion. Judge Newsom disagreed. He said, in context, the speech should be reasonably understood not as a true threat, but essentially the same way that Ignatiev's statement should be understood, as just sort of a general condemnation of what is seen as Jewish privilege the argument would be that Damsky would make, just like Ignatius was condemning what he saw as white privilege, and that Tinker shouldn't really apply at all to the higher education context, and that advocacy of illegal conduct, again, unless it fits within the narrow exception for incitement of imminent illegal conduct, that should be viewed as constitutionally protected when said by students in higher education institutions, and especially in professional schools where everybody is even older, presumably more mature. So a pretty sharp difference between the majority and the dissent on all of these issues. One thing to keep in mind is under the majority's rationale, this could extend to a considerable range of advocacy of illegal violence. Globalize the intifada, right? Some people may perceive that as just a call to have a global campaign against Israel's actions, whether in Gaza or global campaign for essentially uh, uh, keeping Israel from enduring as a Jewish state, but it could also be understood as, well, the Intifada is violence against Jews in Israel. Well, globalizing it is engage in violence against Jews in America and elsewhere. Likewise, various other kinds of speech, for example, praise for, I guess, Luigi Mangione, the man who murdered the
The
healthcare
C.
executive, or
Mhm.
other such things, could also be understood as advocacy of illegal violence, and could therefore be potentially punished by public educational institutions under the majority's rationale. Maybe that's
So
right.
but actually, I don't know that that's what they said. So I mean, I get that Morse involved mere, the reliance
Hmm.
on Morse might suggest that the majority opinion was focused on sort of multiple rationales for allowing
Hmm.
more regulation of speech in the university context. But so much of the analysis focused on disruption, and they pulled out a lot of facts having to do with the staff and students feeling nervous and avoiding Damsky and contexts where they might see Damsky. And plus also their attempt to distinguish Mahanoy area school districts. So that's the even more recent Supreme Court case, finding that K through 12 students have First Amendment, have fairly robust First Amendment rights that can't be trampled when they're using social media and off-campus speech, where basically they can only be punished for off-campus speech when that off-campus speech causes a substantial disruption. A substantial disruption that is reasonable is kind of what I think that what the 11th Circuit is trying to do, not perfectly clearly, but I think what they're trying to do is set up a rule where there needs to not only be a response based on a substantial disruption, but that substantial disruption needs to, in some sense, be reasonable. Um, at least I think that's the best
Right.
version of what I think
Right.
the 11th Circuit is
So,
trying to do.
so that may be so. The opinion, after talking about the threat concern, then
Mhm.
says, now we turn to the second reason the Damsky's posts are likely not protected speech. They promoted extra legal violence. So it gives as a separate reason, beyond their being potentially threatening, that they advocated illegal violent conduct. And it draws an analogy to Morse v. Frederick, which involved illegal drug use, or let's say speech that was understood as advocacy of illegal drug use. Now, it's true, even in that section, it talks in some measure about disruption. But
Yeah.
I think it's getting there, disruption that doesn't come from the threatening nature of the speech, but disruption that may come from the advocacy nature of the speech.
Yeah.
So I do think
Okay.
that
Agreed
under
there.
the
Yep.
rationale, if somebody is saying in a university or in a law school is saying, excuse me, not in there necessarily, but
Yeah.
while a
Right.
student
Right.
is saying
Yeah.
online, I support violent revolution. I think police officers, I think people should shoot police officers. I think violence against ICE agents is legitimate. I think we should globalize the Intifada. I think it's good that people are shooting healthcare executives. If somebody says that, perhaps it's not completely clear, but perhaps the majority would still require some disruption. But if there is disruption because people are understandably
Hmm.
very upset at these calls for illegal violence, especially by someone who's trained to be a lawyer, it sounds like they would accept the advocacy of illegal violence as an independent rationale, even in the absence of a finding of something could be reasonably perceived as a threat of violence.
I agree with that. I just want to make sure that we both understand the second rationale, the one that's not a threat, but just based on advocacy. I read the opinion to require not just advocacy of violence, but advocacy of violence that then is likely to cause a substantial disruption.
It's possible. I think it's a little ambiguous there, but
Okay, it might be ambiguous,
you
but
may be
okay.
right. So there are
Okay.
these two rationales which may both be coupled to disruption, but one is essentially the reasonably perceived as a threat rationale,
Yeah.
and the other is advocacy of illegal violence rationale.
Yes. Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so then let's turn to the Ohio State case. Now. Um, uh, that case involved a student, Guy Christensen, who was disenrolled by Ohio State. Looked to me like pretty close to an expulsion, or maybe some technical differences. And what had happened was that in May of last year, two Israeli embassy employees in Washington, D.C. were murdered by someone who was targeting them because they were going to an event that was at a Capitol Jewish Museum hosted by the American Jewish Committee. And at first, Christensen had posted something condemning those murders. And this Christensen was an anti-Israel advocate. But then he posted a video which says, "I take it back. I do not condemn the elimination of those two Zionist officials who worked at the Israeli embassy." And he talked about how he sees the Israeli actions against Palestinians as murdering thousands in cold blood. And he says, "We will meet this action with our own, let's say Israeli action, quote, with our own greater resistance and escalation. Um, and we must meet with escalation and stronger resistance." That's an extra quote there. And he also read the murderer's manifesto, which had been posted on social media, which, thus in context, it sounds like he was uh, at least plausibly understood as endorsing the murder of Jews or Israelis. Doesn't really matter which, for these purposes, one way or the other, would be endorsing murder in the U.S., not just endorsing violence overseas. The fact is, people often endorse military action or even terrorist action in foreign countries. That's sort of part of a debate about what's the right way of resolving basically wars in foreign places. But it sounded like he was, in fact, at least could be plausibly understood as endorsing murder in the U.S. Now, later, he posted another video responding to the backlash in which he said that I'm not calling for people to make threats. Quote, "I'm nonviolent," close quote. But of course, some people thought, well, the things that he had said earlier suggest that at least he's endorsing violence, whether or not he himself claims to be nonviolent. So he sued, and there in the district court basically held that his speech was likely constitutionally protected. So it also applied the Tinker standard, but it said there wasn't enough evidence of disruption here, in part because the speech was said basically after he had left campus because it was the end of the semester. And that the evidence, while the record evidence contains, I'm sorry, while the record contains evidence, the court said that the posts were offensive to many people, it contains no evidence that it caused or would cause a disruption so significant as to meet Tinker's high standard. Uh, and note, the court didn't talk at all about any theory that advocacy of violence or speech that could plausibly be
Hmm.
understood as advocating violence could be independently restricted. It said essentially it could only be restricted to the extent that it causes substantial amount of disruption. So it's interesting. I mean, the result, it's actually the same as the result of the district court in the Damsky case, but it's different from the result of the 11th Circuit in the Damsky case. Uh, and by the way, it was decided a few days after Damsky. So the court at least had the opportunity to consider
To reconsider.
the
Yeah.
11th Circuit decision, although I believe it did not cite to it. Um,
Although I think they could be I mean, if we wanted to, we could
yes,
reconcile these based on the
absolutely.
facts, right? So
Right,
maybe
right. So you might
maybe we
say,
could spend a couple minutes doing that.
right,
Yeah.
right. So yeah, of course, you might say, well, there was more evidence of disruption in one place than in another place.
Yeah, yeah.
In one place, it was during the semester. In one place, it was not during the semester. In one place, there was the follow-on conversation between Damsky and the law professor, which might have been seen as kind of making things seem potentially even more threatening. Plus, also there'd been more of a backstory to Damsky's
Yeah.
past statements as well. Although, of course, it was also pretty clear that Christensen had long been very, very sharply critical of Israel, and in context, that could have been seen as just sort of a follow-on, saying, yes, all those statements really were past statements were also kind of endorsements of violence. So yeah,
I
it
think,
could
yeah.
be, it could
Although
be.
I think the disruption itself, it looks like the University of Florida prepared the evidence base a lot
Mm,
more carefully. So it had in the record that a staff member had at first had her profile website removed, and then eventually actually even left the department. It had it described an incident which I think could be both sort of non-speech conduct incident where Damsky got locked out of a room and started pounding on the glass and said, "Open the effing door." And that reaction to a locked door really sort of, I guess, frightened some stuff. So it had a lot of detail that I think a university if it is going to go down this route, probably should make sure it marshals and the students coming to the dean and whatnot. So they had at least documented some evidence of
right.
disruption.
So Jane, you're absolutely right. And I think that is actually a very important thing to understand about some of these cases, especially when you get to a test like disruption, and disruption that could stem from people being sufficiently upset, and evidence of people being
Hmm.
sufficiently upset. So let's let's consider two just completely abstract cases. Maybe they're similar to these two, maybe they're different. It could be about any topic. In one of them, somebody says something really offensive, and people get offended, maybe feel a little bit threatened, maybe even take action. They decide not to show up to school one day or something like that. But the only evidence that is in the record, the only evidence that it can be put in the record, is somebody sending emails saying, "I don't like this. I'm offended by this." I think many a court would say, that may not be enough. Just the fact that you're offended. Maybe in some other context, if enough customers are offended by the actions of an employee of some government agency that is seeking customers, maybe that might be enough. But when you're talking about a higher education institution where some amount of controversy is to be expected, simply the fact that people are offended is not enough. But let's say that those people frame the emails as, "I feel offended, I feel intimidated, I'm not sure if I should show up to school tomorrow. I'm wondering if this person is possibly going to do some other bad things. It feels like a hostile educational environment to me because it is intimidating." If they
Yes.
frame things in that way, then I think courts, given the disruption standard, are much more likely to accept that. Now, of course, you could imagine a situation where somebody is offended but doesn't feel at all intimidated, is certainly not going to keep away from school as a result, in which case, presumably, the record will reflect that and that there's really no real disruption. But you could also imagine situations where people really do feel both, because I do think a lot of people in many situations, especially when there's talk that's kind of about potential violence and such, really might feel quite not just upset but intimidated. But it's really a question of how they've learned or how they've been taught to frame this in
Mhm.
whatever messages they send. So if the person quite sincerely focuses, the person who's both intimidated and offended quite sincerely focuses on the offense part, maybe because they think that's what's most important, just the first thing that comes to their
Mhm.
mind,
Right, they're
then
not trained in First Amendment law and
right,
the disruption test, so they just
exactly.
say, "Hey, I don't like this." Right.
Exactly. Then the school, at least if it's following the law, would presumably have to say, oh, sorry, we have to protect the speech. On the other hand, if the people with exactly the same reaction recognize either just happen to stress the intimidation part, or they recognize that, again, I hope sincerely, I hope they're not lying about it, although who knows, but they recognize that it's important to highlight how they do feel potentially intimidated, menaced, and so on and so forth. Then, in that case, that gives the school a record based on which they probably could get away with suspending or even expelling the student. So it's so
So yeah, so I mean, this is a legal rule where if this is the if this is going to be the enduring rule for universities, and
right,
I want to ask you in a little bit whether you
right.
think it should be, but if we are going to take the tinkerish rule of substantial disruption and apply it to the university context, um, it can be gamed. It can become a kind of snowflake's veto, sort of like a heckler's veto or something, right? Like where people say that they're going to avoid classes or something when they're not. But one thing about these facts that that struck me was that there are some signs of of a feeling of threat that are more costly, like leaving the staff member leaving the department. I mean, who knows? Maybe the staff person would have taken a new job anyways, but that's pretty costly. And students not coming to a build, law
Mhm.
students famously kind of, oriented toward getting good grades, not coming to class is sort of a big deal. So there might be ways for courts to even probe, but there's a risk anytime there's anytime there's a fairly gray area, muddy rule like this. I think there's a risk that it can be um, exploited or just it's just vague, and so it means we're adopting a constitutional rule that has sort of a vague edge, right?
Right, right. So it's partly that it's vague, but also partly that it calls for prediction and
That's true.
calls for prediction of something that is in some measure within the power of the listeners, the very people who may be objecting to it. So if somebody, it's true, if somebody has to say, I didn't show up to class, and it's only that will be that will count as disruption. Then I think you might say, well, okay, people do have to kind of put their money where their mouth is in a sense, and if enough people say that, maybe that is a sign that really they really are frightened. On the other hand, if it's enough to say to that and it send an email saying, I'm not sure, should I be showing up to school? I feel really intimidated. Again, this could be
Hmm.
quite accurate if there's if not dishonest, maybe a little bit spinning, a little bit of spin there, but maybe not even. Maybe people genuinely, sincerely say that, whenever I hear somebody talking about possible violence against Jews, I'm a Jew, I'm wondering if I should show up to class. And then all the school has to do is show that, well, there was enough of that we can then predict there'll be even more of that. Again, not implausible, because presumably for everybody who sends an email, there may be 10 people who have that reaction and don't send an email.
Hmm.
That by itself might be enough to again, under this material likelihood of substantial disruption test, to justify a suspension and expulsion. And again, what that will do as people learn about it is it'll channel more and more people into making that kind of argument. we have a situation where the heckler's veto, that is generally condemned as a basis for restricting speech in most situations, might very well be operating here. That if enough people are not just offended, but are willing to say that they are made uneasy, that they feel intimidated, that they feel menaced, that they may, as a result, not show up to class, or may, as a result, change their behavior in other ways, then that might be enough to justify suppressing the speech of the person. Maybe that's right. Maybe we should say, look, if you're going to go
Yeah.
to an educational institution with other people, then you have to understand you shouldn't be doing things and saying things that at the same time sharply undermine the effectiveness, or I mean, not even sharply, maybe even slightly undermine the potential effectiveness of that educational institution by, for example, making people feel uneasy about going there. But I do think we have to recognize that that kind of heckler's veto is what decisions like the 11th Circuit one are in some measure, rightly or wrongly endorsing.
Yeah, so let me defend yeah, let me maybe defend the position that tinker is the right rule to apply here, despite the fact that it is basically a an embrace of the heckler's veto, sort of. And that actually, this picks up some of the themes that came up in our last podcast episode, where I've been thinking about this. What are we to do when there's a public university that, for all practical purposes, is trying to compete with other universities, including private universities, and the other universities, they can require a certain minimum level of professionalism and comfort or whatnot for their students. Obviously, uh, obviously, I don't think it would be great for a university of any sort, public or private, to have strict speech codes. But I do worry about a situation where public universities wind up losing future students or faculty because they are at such a disadvantage for certain high profile, even if, infrequent sort of cases like this one. And so the analogy that I keep thinking of is with public employment, that maybe the Tinker test effectively is like a Pickering balancing test, where Pickering allows public employees, to be able to engage in a lot of speech on public on matters of public concern when they're not at work. But there is some limit where, when that speech outside of the outside the workplace winds up affecting the workplace, that's when the balancing part of the test comes in. And so and there's also, I guess it also makes sense as a conceptual level if you think about how we normally divide the university's functions across the venue analysis. So, or forum analysis. I'm sorry, forum analysis. So the main university square, that's where, that's where we sort of expect a free speech, free for all. But when we're talking about students who are nervous about going to class, maybe it makes sense to let the school have a little bit more control over the environment. I don't know how I feel. I feel a little, uneasy. I get a little bit of heartburn talking this way, but I see the logic of
Right,
um, having some sort of ability to constrain
right.
student enrollment on the basis of awful but lawful speech.
Well, right. So, although I take it your logic would be that if Damsky had said the same things in that public forum on that quad, he
If
would
it
even
made
be
it
more
back,
clearly subject to expulsion than if when he said it on private property by posting it on X. I take it you'd say that the focus should be on whether people are worried about going to class, regardless of whether the statement is
where
in,
it's made. No, I
yeah,
agree.
in the quad or online.
That's right. What I mean by that though is if some if some member of the general public goes to a university and says what Damsky said
Mhm.
in the quad, in the public quad, the university doesn't get to manage its land. But, the university is a
Why
very
not? Why not? Because they could say, well, we're afraid that people will stop showing up to campus and stop studying in the quad and stop engaging in their own things in the quad because they're afraid they're going to see anti-Semites, whether of
yeah.
the white supremacist variety or the pro-Palestinian anti-Israel variety. If they see them in the quad,
Yeah.
just won't show up to class anymore.
Well, what I mean is just as a matter of pure description of how the form analysis works today, maybe we should care and worry about people not showing up to the quad anymore, but purely descriptively, the university cannot prevent an outsider from coming to the quad and saying whatever protected speech that they want.
Right, right.
Um, but obviously, the university gets to make lots of decisions when it comes to inside the classroom
Right, although
for
Damsky's speech
enrollment.
was outside the classroom.
I know, but so I'm only making a rough analogy. But
Mhm.
when the university is deciding whether Damsky can be a student at all, they're thinking about his impact on the classroom, inside the classroom. And so maybe that's a basis for finding that the rules should apply a little differently
Mhm. Got it.
because as a matter of controlling the classroom rather than the quad, right?
So let me step back a bit, because I think you identify a really important point, which is the government often operates in special roles as administrator of various programs, not as a sovereign who can tell you we're going to throw you in prison if you say certain things, but as an educator, K through 12 or higher education, or as an employer, or as manager of property. And one question is that enduring question is how much, if any, extra power should the government have in these kinds of contexts? And as you point out, sometimes it's, especially if it's competing with other entities, why shouldn't it have a lot more like what a private entity has, power that it has? And private entities basically have unlimited power over what goes on their property within their programs. So it reminds me of a conversation I had probably, a good 25 years now with a uh, uh, extremely and rightly respected, I certainly respect him very much, constitutional law scholar. I haven't checked with him if it's okay to use this conversation. So that's why I'm not going to use his name, but
Yeah.
very serious guy. And he was generally, I think, very much in favor of constitutional rules that protect, for example, speech in public parks and such. Generally, he was a liberal scholar, and those are generally historically very liberal justices, like Justice Brennan and such, were very big on saying, yes, of course, in the traditional public forum, like a park, speech should be free. But he says,
Hmm.
well, wait a minute. Really rich people, if they want to go and relax and not be bothered by a demonstration or by leafleters or by protesters, whether because the demonstration is offensive or anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim or whatever else, uh, or just because they just don't like to be distracted by the noise or by the crowds. They're rich. They've got huge backyards. They've got country clubs. They could go and they could relax. And let's say a city says, we want to give our poor and middle income residents the same sort of opportunity to relax, free of these kinds of potentially offensive statements, free of distractions, free of disruptions, as the rich people do. The rich people go to their country club. The, the poor and the middle class, and also the rich, if they want to, can go to the park. And if somebody wants to have a demonstration in the park, we're going to tell them, our competitors for entertainment, in a sense, the country club, they can exclude people. We should be able to do the same in order to benefit our citizens who can't afford access to all that privately owned, privately managed open space. I thought that's a very powerful argument against
Hmm.
the traditional public forum doctrine, against broad protection for speech in government-owned public places. I think, on balance, despite that, I think the court is probably right to say that when the government owns property, it really shouldn't have the same rights as a private property owner there, at least as to certain kinds of property. And I'd say the same probably for higher education. But I do think that this point that
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
professor is
It's a
making,
good point. It's
a broadening of the point you're making,
yeah.
there's a lot to it that it does put public institutions, and more importantly, those who end up having to patronize them, maybe because they can't afford the private
Mhm.
institutions, in a position where they can't be shielded from offensive or disruptive or distracting speech the same way that the rich or the people who go to private universities can be.
Yeah. That said, I think, and I can attest to this, there is also, though, some benefit to having a university that is, forced to comply with the full extent of the First Amendment law as it applies to universities, at least. Which is that as a professor, I know for sure that the rules that apply, for example, to tenured professors are restricted, and so I know that my employer is not going to be able to change the uh,
Right.
the expectations
Right.
for
And
me.
the
So
other thing to keep in mind, and I do think this is, we have to always remember this is how the doctrine developed. It really, I mean, it's very easy to say, the anti-Semites, the people who talk about abolishing Jewishness by any means necessary. Maybe even the people like Christensen, perhaps I would say, there's not much difference between that and advocating for, or at least speaking out in support of Americans being murdered
mhm,
because they attend a function of the Jewish Museum, or even because they work at Israeli embassy. You could say, yeah, no, we're better off rid of them to the extent possible. We're better off with them kicked out of our universities, of our law schools, maybe even locked up if possible. The problem, of course, is it rarely
totally.
stops with that, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
this is one of the things we've seen. This is, well, something else. It's just tantamount to anti-Semitism. Harsh criticism of
Mhm,
Israel is tantamount of anti-Semitism,
mhm,
or
mhm,
or praise of violent resistance against Israel. Well, that's advocacy of killing too. But again, if you
mhm,
can suppress that, then becomes perilous for any student to be talking about foreign wars, or foreign other kind of armed conflicts, where unfortunately the reality is people are slaughtering each other, and sometimes the argument is one side should prevail even by killing more of the other side.
yeah,
So it becomes very likely that the restrictions that focus on a very narrow range of things, maybe say anti-Semitic threats in America to Americans, maybe, or could be understood as that, to become broader and broader. Likewise, the line between harsh condemnation of abortion and advocacy of killing of abortion providers, between harsh condemnations of animal experimentation and advocacy of violence against animal experimenters. Those are pretty tough lines to draw. Criminal law draws them at something like true threats of violence. But the
mhm,
whole point in cases like Damsky is, well, even if it's not a true threat of violence, it's close enough, it's on the way there, that in the university it should be restrictable. Again, I think we're going to, if that's allowed, we're going to see calls for more and more such speech being restricted. After all,
yeah,
if their calls for illegal violence are punishable, well, what about calls for illegal discrimination? What about something that
right,
is
right.
perceived as supposedly racist or supposedly sexist or homophobic or transphobic? I think we've all seen a lot of situations where calls for very narrow exceptions to free speech have been pretty quickly broadened to calls for broader ones.
That is correct. Well, I can just tell you, I am glad that I was not an administrator last semester because on top of all of the facts that we recounted in this case, around the time of that X post that we read, the X post, there was a live shooter at Florida State University just down the road here, and so I think um, I think it was very hard to understand when listeners are being oversensitive versus when they are kind of picking up true signs of some mental disorder or or um, a real threat, even if it's a small chance, a non-zero,
Right.
significant chance. So. Yeah.
Right. So that's an excellent point, and it's worth also highlighting maybe as a little separate from what we said before, but very closely related. Um, Sometimes the argument isn't so much the speech is threatening violence or advocating violence as it just suggests that this person, sort of evidence that this person might be a menace.
Right.
And um, uh, or sometimes it's not even about violence, right? Sometimes the statement that is perceived as, say, racist by, say, a professor, people say, well, that may be evidence that the professor will discriminate against blacks or whites or Jews or non-Jews or whatever else. And that's a very serious concern, right? I mean, you could imagine something that someone says that seems, on the one hand, it's not criminally punishable, but on the other hand, makes you kind of wonder, is this person totally either mentally with it or totally in control, perhaps, of their anger?
Hmm.
Is it somebody who's going to do something really bad? Now, in the criminal law context, we don't usually punish people in any event for things they might do unless they've actually taken some steps. But as an employer, of course, setting aside the First Amendment, many employers will say, like, if somebody says something that suggests they're going to do something bad, whether because it suggests they're kind of unhinged or
Hmm.
because it suggests that that they are willing to break the law or break employer rules for certain reasons. Well, we're probably better off not having them. So one question is, to what extent can public employers and public educators use similar kinds of arguments? Again, on the one hand, perfectly plausible. On the other hand, potentially a very broad power for government acting as employer or as educator to fire or expel people because of some hypothesis, however plausible, of what they might do in the future.
Right.
Well, all right, Jane. Thank you very much, as always. Very interesting topic, as always. And thank you to all of you for listening.
Hopefully, the next time we talk, it won't it won't be about something that's happening at my doorstep. But
There you go. There you go.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.